All right, before we start, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. So in the spirit of reconciliation, we would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and their connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and we extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. My name's Dr. Jen Sanger. I'm joining you from Lutruwita, Tasmania, which is home to the Pakana Palawa people. So I'd like to say a massive thank you for joining us today. We're here to launch the report of a new Swift Parrot policy. The report is called On the Edge of Extinction, the case for the Swift Parrot Swift Parrot Protection Plan. So the Swift Parrot is critically endangered, and we need to act now if we are to save this species from extinction. Unfortunately, what we've seen from the government is inadequate policies over the last decade that have been exacerbating this decline. So we have put together a policy that properly manages for Swift parrots and protects their habitat. And as I'll tell you later on in the presentation, we can show you how easy this is to implement. So we have a few speakers here today. As I said, my name's Dr. Jennifer Sanger. I'm from the Tree Projects, and I'm one of the report authors, along with my colleague, Dr. Nick Fitzgerald. I will be doing a bit of a presentation to run through the major points of the report, and we will also be hearing from Dr. Eric Voller from BirdLife Tasmania and Tom Allen from the Wilderness Society. So if you have any questions, we'll have time for a session at the end to do a bit of Q&A. And with your questions, down the bottom, you'll see a box that says Q&A. And if you can type your questions into that, that would be excellent. And you can do that at any stage during this talk. All right, I'll just get started with the presentation. So I'll just share my screen if you bear with me for 2 seconds. Okay. All right. So for those of you who just joined us, we're here today to talk about the new report called On the Edge of Extinction, the case for the Swift Parrot Protection Plan. This report has been supported by the Tree Projects, the Wilderness Society and BirdLife Tasmania. So a little bit about the Swift Parrot. So the Swift Parrot is quite an iconic and charismatic species. It's one of the fastest, it is the fastest species of parrot in the world, hence its name, the Swift Parrot. And it's been known to fly at speeds of up to 88 kilometres an hour. It's quite special because it migrates from the mainland each year down to Tasmania. And it's one of only 3 species of parrot in the world that actually migrates. Unfortunately, the Swift Parrot is at serious risk of extinction. So recent population estimates from last year suggest there's only 750 individuals left in the world. And this is a dramatic decline from a decade ago when there was the last estimate was 2,000. So there has been a significant drop in the numbers, and hence it's now listed as critically endangered. And scientists have actually done studies and found that there's a serious risk of this species becoming extinct in the next 10 years. So a little bit about the Swift Parrot's habitat. So as I mentioned, they migrate from the mainland where they spend their summer, and they come down here to Tasmania to breed. Now there's 2 types of habitat that are important for the Swift Parrot. The first is what's called foraging habitat, and this is the trees that they feed on. So they feed on the nectar from Tasmanian bluegum, the black gum and Brooker's gum. And the other type of habitat that's important to them is what's called nesting habitat. And so this is any species of eucalypt that's old enough to have a hollow, and they use these hollows for nesting. As a result, old growth forests and mature forests are really important for the swift parrot. This is because their nests only occur in the hollows of old trees, but also big blue gum trees and big nectar trees are really important habitat for them as well. So the thing about swift parrots, they actually nest in different locations each year. So if we have a look at this map, it shows the different areas that they nest each year. And the reason because of this variation is that their main food source, the Tasmanian blue gum, doesn't flower consistently each year. So it might flower in one location one year and another one later on. And then also too, there's differences in the intensities in which they flower each year. So this is what makes swift parrot management quite difficult, is because the species are not located in one area. They're spread all the way up the east coast of Tasmania and down in the southern forests as well. So why is the swift parrot in the state that it's in? Well, the main factor that's been leading to the decline in swift parrot is habitat loss. So since the last 200 years, since European invasion, we've seen a massive reduction in their habitat. And unfortunately, the habitat is still being logged. So one of the biggest threats to the species right now is the logging of its habitat. There are other threats. So bushfires is one of them. That's as they increase with climate change, that's going to be more of a concern. And the other one that you may have heard of is the threat of sugar gliders. Now, sugar gliders are these cute, innocent looking little possums, but they're actually introduced into Tasmania. And the thing is that these possums can be quite vicious predators. So they've been known to go into nests and eat swift parrot eggs, but also eat chicks. And then at times even they can take out adult birds. While this is a threat in some locations, the threat of sugar gliders has often been overstated. And the reality is that sugar glider numbers are higher in areas that are disturbed and that have already been logged. So when it comes down to it, the number one threat to the swift parrot is habitat loss. And in this day and age, the biggest source of loss is through native forest logging. So what we've seen over the last 10 years is an absolute failure by the state government to protect swift parrots. So on our state forests, there's a whole range of different policies and laws that are meant to protect threatened species from the impact of logging. A lot of these policies are weak and ineffective, and this is especially true when we look at the swift parrot. So a lot of the policies that manage swift parrots, they're just not strong enough, and there's a lot of loopholes. So essentially, a lot of the policies are what are referred to as recommendations rather than being legally binding instruments. As a result of this, we've seen a lot of loopholes. So we've seen some prime swift parrot habitat be logged just because they're able to, take a little shortcut here and there. Also, too, what we see is when an area of swift parrot habitat is proposed for logging, it's assessed by a contractor, and then it's meant to be, if it's deemed good habitat for swift parrots, it then gets referred to an expert for their advice. And what we've seen over the last 5 or so years is there's been multiple occasions where experts have given their advice to the government and said, This is excellent swift parrot habitat. It needs to be protected as it's vital for the long-term survival of the species. And then the government has gone ahead and completely ignored this advice and have logged these areas anyway. I think the worst case, what we've seen lately in the last couple of years, was an area in the Southern Forest called Tyler's Hill. Now, Tyler's Hill was used by Swift Parrot researchers. It had been a long-term monitoring plot, which had been used for about 10 years. So some of the researchers showed up one summer to undertake some surveying, only to find that the whole area had been completely clear-felled. What's even worse too is there has been instances where government-employed Swift Parrot experts have actually felt pressured by senior government officials to change their advice when it comes to logging. So on a bit of a side note here is a picture of me standing on a stump of an area of forest that was logged in 2019. So we're still seeing, even in this day and age, old growth forests in Tasmania being logged, and we're losing hundreds of hectares of swift parrot habitat every year. Unfortunately, it's still the sad thing about this too is that the area behind me, that forest there, has been deemed by swift parrot experts as being possibly the best swift parrot habitat in the whole state. And unfortunately, that's earmarked for logging in 2023. So the threat still continues. So the government has been under pressure to actually act on swift parrot. This is a very important issue that a lot of people have been talking about for a long time. And so the government has come up with this new policy, which they call the PAMA. So this is an acronym for something rather dull, like Public Authority Management Agreement. And the details on this policy are quite scant, but from what we can tell, it's actually weaker than the existing weak policies that exist. So whenever the issue of swift parrots is mentioned, the government always falls onto this, this new policy, and they say, oh, the PAMA, we're going to be protecting 10,000 hectares of swift parrot habitat. But when you look at it and look at where these areas actually are, 70% of the area of this 10,000 hectares is areas that are not actually under threat from logging. They're already excluded from logging. So this is because they're either already in informal reserves, or they're areas that are classed as what's called unviable to log. So it's not commercially viable for them to log. So in reality, the PAMA is only protecting 2,900 hectares from logging. So this is a far cry from the 10,000 hectares that the government has been talking about. So this is why my colleagues and I have decided to come up with an alternative policy. The existing policies are not working. These new policies that they're recommending are even worse. And so we just wanted to show what it would take to actually protect these species. So we came up with what is referred to as the Swift Parrot Protection Plan. Now, this has had extensive consultation. We've consulted with about 18 different scientists, and this has ranged from swift parrot experts, bird specialists, through to general conservation scientists. And the main aim of the plan is to protect all swift parrot habitat and then set aside some future habitat for them as well. So the first element of the plan is to protect 40,000 hectares of the current habitat, which is in state forests that are currently managed for logging. And we want to go one step further and add an additional 50%, so another 20,000 hectares of what we refer to as future habitat. So this is areas that are likely to become important for the swift parrot in the next couple of decades. So in all, the Swift Parrot Protection Plan aims to protect 60,000 hectares of area in state forest, which is currently managed for logging. So this equates to about 7% of that area. So it's not much when we look at the whole scheme of things. Two other really important elements of this plan is that we want this to be a legally binding instrument. What we've been seeing with other policies is that they're weak recommendations and they're not actually being enforced. Another really important thing is that these areas be placed into formal reserves so they get long-term permanent protection. So how easily would it be to implement this plan? So a lot of you may not be aware, but the Tasmanian government sets a legally binding quota for how much area and how much logs should be available for logging each year. Now, this is quite a high quota at the moment. So it's currently at 137,000 cubic metres. And the thing is, this state-run logging agency, Sustainable Timbers Tasmania, it's really expensive for them to actually meet these targets. And so they're actually losing millions of dollars each year trying to meet these quotas. And so what we actually saw 5 years ago is the Board of Sustainable Timbers Tasmania actually formally requested for the quota to be lowered by 30%. Now, the Resources Minister, Guy Barnett, refused this request. For what reason? Well, we can only really guess that it had something to do with politics and nothing to do with actually, anyway. So what we're advocating for in the Swift Parrot Protection Plan is that if we remove this quota or if we lower the quota, there will be more than enough to account for the Swift Parrot Protection Plan. So it's a bit of a win-win situation. So if we lower the quota, even if we accept this 30% reduction that was formally requested by Sustainable Timbers Tasmania, not only would we be able to provide adequate protection for the Swift Parrot, but we'd also make it so that the forestry industry in Tasmania wasn't being propped up by millions of dollars of taxpayers' funding each year. So just in summary, I'll just go over things because there's a lot of information here, but in summary, the existing policies that we have protecting swift parrots, and not even swift parrots, a lot of Tasmanian's threatened species that exist on forestry land, they're not strong enough. They're weak, they're ineffective, there's lots of loopholes. The government's new plan for the swift parrot, the PAMA, is not as good as what they claim. It's not protecting 10,000 hectares. In reality, it's only protecting 2,900, and this is simply not enough to protect the swift parrot. Implementing this plan will just ensure that the species continues to decline over time in numbers. So our alternative policy that we have created, it will protect all swift parrot habitat, and it will set some aside for the future as well. It will equate to about 7% of the area that's currently logged, currently managed for logging. And this could be really easily implemented by either removing or reducing the logging quota. And it makes sense. If we do reduce the quota, we can offer adequate protection for the swift parrot, and we could make sure that forestry is not hemorrhaging money every year. But the thing is, action is needed now. Time is running out. The swift parrot it's absolutely critical that proper action is taken now. So I feel that this solution is quite easy. If you look at all the threatened species that we have in Australia, a lot of the issues surrounding them, they're quite complicated. So there's not often the budget to study these threats properly, and often they're quite complex issues like climate change or competition from introduced species. And these are things that are really difficult to manage. But what we have here in Tasmania, we have the Swift Parrot. It's one of the best studied threatened species in Australia. We know what's causing its decline, and that is the destruction of its habitat. And that's the thing. The main destruction of the habitat is coming from native forest logging. And this is something that could be easily corrected. It just takes the political willpower to do so. So this is where we need your help. We've put a lot of energy into creating the report, and we need your help getting the voice out there to making our politicians listen. So we've created a petition, which I will send you a link to after this webinar. But what I really encourage you to do is take another step forward beyond that and actually email the Premier, Premier Gutwin, the Resources Minister, Guy Barnett, and the Environment Minister as well. So often a lot of people I meet, they feel very politically disengaged, but you just got to remember the politicians are voted in to represent us and to represent our views. And that's why it is so important that we actually use our voice and email them and lobby them and tell them what it is that we want. Another way you could really help is to share this message with friends. If you know anyone who would be interested, share the report. I will put a link in the chat where you can go to our homepage on a website, and it'll have all this information there for you. Great, I'll just stop sharing my screen. Excellent. All right, now I might hand over to Dr. Eric Voller to say a few words.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you for a very good synopsis of both the report and the effort that's been done to date. Good evening, everyone. I'm Eric Voller. If you don't know me, I'm the convener of BirdLife Tasmania. We're the state representation of BirdLife Australia, Australia's oldest national conservation organisation. We've had a long history of involvement with BirdLife, with protecting or trying to protect the Swift Parrot in Tasmania. We've appeared before state inquiries, and certainly there was a federal inquiry that's current at the moment on the extinction crisis that we're seeing in Australia. And certainly, sadly, the Swift Parrot is one of the worst examples in terms of the risk of extinction. As Jen mentioned, the numbers have crashed in the last few years. We're seeing a catastrophic loss of Swift Parrots in Tasmania. The root cause, as Jen has said, is fundamentally the loss of breeding habitat, feeding habitat for these birds. The land use practices that we have in Tasmania are clearly inappropriate for wildlife conservation. We're seeing an increased number of species that are listed as threatened, and we're seeing an ever-increasing number of species whose populations are verging on either endangered or critically endangered. And sadly, the next step beyond critically endangered is extinction. And it's just an unacceptable outcome in the 21st century. Jen's certainly mentioned the role of habitat clearing. We also know that the sugar glider that Jen mentioned is often blamed or used as the scapegoat to argue for, well, it's not forestry operations, it's not land clearing, it's actually the sugar glider that's the culprit. We know that's not the case, and the work that's been done by the ANU team, the Australian National University team in Australia, here in Tasmania, clearly shows that the impact of the sugar glider is actually exaggerated in areas adjacent to forestry operations. And so by ceasing the forestry operations, you'll actually take out the first threat to the species, but then also minimize the next biggest threat to the species. So we get a lot of bang for our buck for one single action. I want to also just mention briefly that while this report and the effort is focused on Swift Parrots, we also recognise that other species, other woodland species, will also benefit from these efforts to go into a habitat conservation paradigm rather than dealing with a single species. And so other species of woodland birds, such as the wedge-tailed eagle, the masked owl, and the grey goshawk, all of which are listed endangered in Tasmania, and all of them are endangered as a result of habitat loss, would also benefit from the Swift Parrot proposal that's on the subject of the discussion this evening. So really, from a BirdLife perspective, both from a national perspective and also from a Tasmania-focused perspective, we totally endorse this report, totally support the report, and we'll be working very hard to see what we can do, not just to get the message out, but actually to see some sort of response by the government. As Jen has said, it's really a function of the lack of political willpower. We know what the threats are, we know what we need to do to stop those threats, and yet there's just this absolute reluctance to accept the science and to recognise that past practices have led us to the situation that we're in at the moment, and that has to change. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Jen.
Thanks so much, Eric. And I'll now hand over to Tom Allen from the Wilderness Society.
Thanks, Jen. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in Lutruwita, Tasmania, the Palawa people. Of course, what we're talking about is forests that belong to the first Tasmanians, if you like. And I'd also like to congratulate Dr. Sanger and Dr. Nick Fitzgerald and BirdLife and the Tree Projects and Wilderness Society on producing this report, because it is a landmark report. As I hope, thanks Eric, as I hope people understand, and that Jen and Eric have made clear, extinction is a choice. And extinction is a choice that's still being made by too many state governments and businesses who basically accept low environmental standards. Let's not forget that in the last week or so, who would have thought that the koala would be declared endangered? And the Swift Parrot is Tasmania's koala. What they both have in common, the koala and the Swift Parrot, is that their habitat is being destroyed by unsustainable practices, land clearing and deforestation in Queensland, deforestation in New South Wales, deforestation in Victoria, and deforestation right here in Tasmania. Around the world, the single biggest cause of habitat loss of species loss is habitat destruction. And the koala, leadbeater's possum in Victoria, Swift Parrot, these are all symptoms of the sixth mass extinction crisis, which is being driven around the world by unsustainable practices, as we're seeing here in Tasmania. And why this report is so significant is because, unlike all the other previous Swift Parrot reports and sort of half-hearted attempts by government, this report does what all the others have not, and that proposes protecting their habitat definitively and once and for all. And the Swift Parrot, we're talking about the world's fastest parrot, has been in decline for years because its habitat has been being logged unsustainably. We, Wilderness Society and Tree Projects and Forestry Watch and others, have spent the summer in Lonavale Forest in southern Tasmania. And we've seen in coop after coop, areas that they log, big old trees that the Swift Parrots use for nesting, and they're nesting in these areas in logging coops. They're feeding in these areas in and around logging coops. And we've seen logging happening in their habitat. It's happening right now. We've seen it with our bare eyes. We've got photographs all over the place, video all over the place of Swift Parrots going in and out of the hollows of these big old trees. And unfortunately for Swift Parrots, they're living in trees that people also like to log. And one of the most galling things for me, and I think lots of other people, is that we're logging the Tasmanian government and businesses that take wood from Forestry Tasmania are logging these forests unnecessarily. Not only does Forestry Tasmania make a commercial loss but around the country and around the world, we're seeing transitions out of native forest logging with a focus to helping technologically adjust transition for forestry workers so that we as societies can get our wood from plantations, no longer from forests. Victoria is transitioning, WA is transitioning, even Queensland is transitioning all away from native forest logging with a focus on plantations so that this forest destruction can end. It's important to note that Forestry Tasmania is still the legal name of the government-owned logging agency in Tasmania. It trades as Sustainable Timber Tasmania, but its legal name remains Forestry Tasmania. And I think there's only one reason it can claim to call itself sustainable, even as a trading name, and that's because its practices are sanctioned by the Responsible Wood Certification Scheme. And it's the only certification scheme that has standards low enough to accept the wood managed by Forestry Tasmania. And so whenever people out there, and people ask what they can do, whenever you see responsible wood, it's really important that people understand this is a certification scheme that is sanctioning, that's saying it's responsible to log high conservation value forests, threatened species habitat. And so it really is awful. It's one of the worst things anyone can do to drive an entire species from the face of the earth. And that's what we are seeing with the Swift Parrot, predicted to go extinct by 2031. I'll finish up, but there's just one last thing I'd like to say. We want to save the Swift Parrot for its own intrinsic worth. Like all animals and plants and all life on Earth, it has intrinsic value far beyond economic. The Latin name of the Swift Parrot is Lactamus discolor. Another bird species is Serinus canaria, and that's the Latin name for the canary. And canaries were used by miners right up until the 1980s. They took them down into the mines, and because canaries had such sensitive constitutions, if there was a gas leak, carbon monoxide or something similar, sulfur, the canary would die before the human, and the human would be able to get out of the mine and hopefully survive. They're called sentinel species. And so we need to understand, we want to protect the Swift Parrot and other species for their own worth, but these species are sentinels that we need to understand are going extinct. And what they are telling us, the sentinel species are telling us that our practices are unsustainable and we need to change direction really quickly. The fantastic thing about this report is it is a solution. It shows that extinction is a choice, and it means so is conservation. And so this plan identifies how we can make conservation a choice. And for the first time, we can make this a good news story. We can protect the Swift Parrot, we can turn its fortunes around, we can make its extinction history, and we can give it a bright future. And that's why I'm really pleased to really strongly endorse this report. And I hope it's supported by the Tasmanian government, the federal government, and by the business community, especially those who buy wood from Forestry Tasmania, who are exposed to deforestation, the logging of high conservation value forests, and the logging of this bird's habitat. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Tom. Now we've got heaps of questions coming in, so I might kick off. Our first question is, what will happen to other wildlife if the Swift Parrot goes extinct? Now, that's a really important question. What researchers have found is that the Swift Parrots are actually really important pollinators from the Tasmanian blue gum and the black gum as well. So if the parrot does get extinct, it's just really not really known what impact that might have on the Tasmanian blue gum. And this is also coming into a time where we're going to be seeing a lot more stresses on these trees, especially when it comes to climate change. So these trees are going to be growing in hotter and drier environments, and it's really important to have that gene flow to make sure that they're fit enough to survive. This could have a whole bunch of flow-on effects to other different species as well. Anything else to add, other panelists? No? All right, cool. There was another question down here it said, this might seem like a silly question, but if the extra land is set aside as you recommend, how would the migratory parrots know where to go breed and nest? I assume they know only a limited forest reserves in present. Well, that's the beauty about our plan, is that we're actually protecting all of their foraging habitat. So that's all of the blue gums and the black gums, but we're also protecting all of the mature forests in their known range. So that's likely to know that's likely to be where they nest, because mature forests have these hollows that they need. Eric or Tom?
I was just going to add to that by protecting all of the habitat, it doesn't force a choice onto the birds. The birds will simply be finding the area. So as Jen mentioned in her talk, the birds breed in different areas each year because it's a function of the extent of flowering, particularly of the blue gum. And so by protecting all of the blue gum habitat, it doesn't matter where the flowering event occurs, the birds will find it. They're very good at finding the feeding resource and the nesting resource. And so by protecting the habitat, the birds will find that they will make the decision as to where they want to nest on the basis of available food and available nesting sites.
I'll just reiterate the point that Jen already made, which is we're talking about just 7% of the production forest to secure the future of the Swift Parrot. And that's 7% of production forest that Forestry Tasmania can't meet already its quota from. So in practice, it wouldn't make, I don't think, any difference to Forestry Tasmania's practices or revenues, but it would secure the Swift Parrot's future.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom.
Can I just add, there was also a question that I saw about needing to protect the bird, or do we need to protect the birds on the mainland as well? The biggest threat to the birds is the loss of breeding and feeding habitat here in Tasmania. They can survive the winter months on the mainland, finding other species, but if they can't breed, that's the real crunch for the population, for the species. And so and obviously, you know, here in Tasmania, this is a report produced for a Tasmanian context. The important thing, the critical habitat, is the breeding habitat that these birds need. If they can't breed, it doesn't matter what other efforts we make for the species. If there's no breeding, there's no survival, there's no species. So the breeding habitat has to take the priority over everything else.
Great, thanks, Eric. So we have rather an irate question from an anonymous attendee. It says, how can you talk as there's no such thing as sugar glider predation, not even a mention of the overriding threat to the parrot? Now, we did address this. We did identify as sugar gliders as being a threat to the parrot. There's no denying that whatsoever. But from the work that I've done with Swift Parrot experts doing this report, all of them state that the threat has been very much over-exaggerated and that the number one threat is habitat loss. And Eric addressed this really, really well. So I might hand over to him to explain it again.
Okay, so I have to remember what I said. We know the root cause, or the primary cause of threat to the Swift Parrot, is the loss of the breed, as I said, the breeding and feeding habitat. So the clearing of land then exaggerates or exacerbates the secondary threat from sugar gliders, with the predation from the sugar gliders. So there was some work that was done by the ANU team a couple of years ago that showed quite clearly that the predation increased on sugar gliders in areas adjacent to the areas that had just been logged. So the clearing of the habitat increases the threat to the birds from predation by the sugar gliders. And, you know, as I said earlier, by stopping the clearing of the habitat, you're reducing the threat to the species from the primary cause, but then also reducing the threat from the secondary cause, which is the sugar glider predation.
And if it's okay, Jen, I just want to acknowledge who is one of the members of the audience today is Dr. Matt Webb, who's watching, who's one of the island's foremost experts on Swift Parrots. So I just want to acknowledge Matt and say hi and good on you. Great.
All right, excellent. We've got another question saying, does the 40,000 hectares of excluded habitat include the approximate 42,000 hectares of Swift Parrot habitat already reserved? Well, now I'm not aware of any areas that have already been reserved. There's hundreds of hectares, sorry, thousands of hectares of Swift Parrot habitat that's within the 3-year plan, which is the logging schedule. And so I can definitely say that not all of Swift Parrot habitat is excluded. So I'd love to have a chat with you about that offline to see what area. It may be that you're confused with area that's already in informal reserves for other areas. But as far as I'm concerned, there's been no areas specifically set aside for Swift Parrot habitat that I'm aware of. Lockie had a question. Is there a map of the area that you're proposing to protect? You're about the 6th person who's asked me that question in the last couple of days, and I wish I could say yes, but that's something that we haven't done yet. We've done the GIS analysis, and the way we were able to present that information wasn't really clear enough to put in the report, but that's something that I'm working on, and we'll hope to get that up online soon. But it's basically, majority of the area is in the southern forest, which is the area where they're concentrated, and it also extends up into the east coast as well too. So the eastern tiers and the east coast are really important because that's where a lot of the black gum is, and they're essential habitat for years where blue gums aren't flowering properly. So we saw that last year. Last summer, it wasn't a very good year for blue gum flowering. So a lot of the Swift Parrots were actually up in the eastern tiers area where they were relying on the black gum and the Brooker's gum. Okay, I've got another question. For what primarily the forests are logged for, and what happens to the logged area? Is the logged area put into use for forestry or livestock or grazing? So that's a really good question. So a lot of the forests in Tasmania, they end up as wood chip. So something like 85% of the forests that are logged end up in chip. And so that turns into temporary products like paper, cardboard, pallets at best. So there's actually very little of these forests that actually end up as usable timber. Once an old growth forest is logged or a mature forest is logged, it then goes into the logging cycle. So a lot of these forests are reseeded and grow back, but the thing is they're then repeatedly logged. So they'll be logged again in the next 40 to 80 years. And that means they're not actually of any use to the Swift Parrot because they rely on hollow-bearing trees for nesting. These trees just don't have time to actually form these hollows in these short cycles. Have you got anything to add with that, Tom or Eric?
I was just going to, I guess, make a comment about the Tasmanian government, and Forestry Tasmania down here has a big tree policy, which, you know, as you've seen from the huge stump that Jen was standing on, doesn't really apply. It's sort of very half-hearted and not legislated. But the policy means that even though the government says they don't log giant trees, they still log baby giant trees. And so the policy is actually stealing giant trees from the future, which obviously isn't helping Swift Parrots or any of the other species that use hollows in big old trees either.
Yeah, definitely. We've got a really good question here. Will it be useful to write to Tasmanian ministers since I'm not a Tasmanian resident? Yes, definitely. And just a quick tip about when you do write to ministers. I was always under the impression that you had to fill these emails with a whole bunch of facts and do a lot of research. But the reality is that politicians have people to do this research for them. What they want to know is how you feel and why it's important to you. So, as if you're joining us from the mainland and you live in an area that have Swift Parrots, I encourage you to write to the Tasmanian politicians about this, because they're the ones that are ultimately affecting the success of Swift Parrots. And for you to continue to enjoy having these species here in your backyard, it all relies on there being adequate breeding habitat down here in Tasmania.
Yeah. I was just going to add, thanks, Jen, that's a really good point. But when a species is listed as endangered or critically endangered, they're listed under the EPVC Act, which is Australia's national environment protection law. And so then the plight of the Swift Parrot becomes a national issue. It becomes an issue for the Commonwealth government as well. So the minister responsible is Susan Lee, and ultimately the Prime Minister. So there is a very welcome need and route to lobby Commonwealth government ministers as well.
Great, excellent. Okay, next one, petition. What type of petition is it? Many parliaments will only table a parliamentary petition. Yes, this is correct. I've just chosen to use the platform change.org, but this can actually be tabled if it is adopted by, we can actually get a member of parliament to table it for us once we've done this. So that's fairly easy. Okay. Okay, here we go. Here's a good one for you, Eric. Does the Swift Parrot have a national recovery plan, as, for example, the orange-belly parrot does?
I believe the recovery plan has been revised and is to be released or discussed by the team in the not too distant future. I'm not involved with that efforts. In some ways, I'm quite happy not to have been on the recovery team, because it would be a challenging task indeed. But yes, there is a plan. My understanding is it's currently in revision and will be released, or certainly by the recovery team sooner rather than later. And with the lead up, we've talked about the election coming up. We may actually see some federal government initiatives looking to establish their environmental credentials.
Excellent, great. We've got another question. Can't the loggers at least leave stags? So this has been I mean, there have been trials where they have tried to leave habitat patches and this in logging coops. But the reality is that it doesn't just really work that well, because a lot of the time, a lot of the practices is to like clear a big area, incinerate it with a really strong fire to encourage the eucalypts to grow back afterwards. And they've found with these habitat clumps and areas that they leave, a lot of the time they're just getting incinerated in the fire, and these trees ultimately end up falling down. Also too, the forest surrounding trees protects, they all protect each other. So often too, when you open up a whole area to logging, yeah, often these trees are now affected by wind and can be thrown by wind. So yeah, what else have we got here? We might start looking to wrap up soon. All right. So I've got a question here. So saying all mature forests and all blue gum blackthorn forests is only 7% of production forest. So this is within the Swift Parrots range I'm talking about. So they only are usually 10 kilometres from the coast, on the east coast and in the southern forest. So there's a lot of area that that's managed for logging, state forests that are managed for logging that occur in other areas. So there's a large section in the northeast, and then also over on the northwest as well too. And Swift Parrots, they can occur there, but it's not their prime habitat. This one might be a good one for you, Eric. Is there a captive population of Swift Parrots, as there is with the OBPs? Obviously, this might help with wild population, so there's a bit of a backup. Have you got any comments on that at all?
I'm unaware of any captive breeding efforts for Swift Parrots at the same scale as what we're seeing with the OBPs. The captive breeding program for the orange-bellied parrot has been successful because it's been used to supplement the wild populations every year, and it's certainly contributed to the increase in numbers in the wild. It may or may not be an option with, there's always issues around husbandry and dealing with captive breeding programs for any species, not just parrots. So I'm unaware of any such program. Whether it's been examined in the past, I don't know. I suspect it's probably been considered by some government agencies at some point in the past.
Although there are scientists working on, trying to help Swift Parrots feed and breed more successfully in Tasmania as well, even though it's not captive breeding. So I probably should just shout out to Dr. Diane Stajanovich, who's leading light in the space, along with plenty of other volunteers as well.
Yeah, so they're putting various mechanisms in place to either close off the hollows or to prevent and particularly to prevent the predation risk from sugar gliders. So if you like, that's you could consider that almost a bit of supplementary breeding or supporting the breeding effort in the wild rather than in captivity.
Yeah.
Great, excellent. I've got another question. What happens if the decline is rapid and, as said, likely extinct by 2031? Will this attract any international treaties or conventions Australia has signed? If yes, can we trigger this at any point? I remember reading somewhere that we do have an international treaty on species. Eric, you might know a little bit more about this.
The one I think you're thinking of is the Bond Convention, which is for the conservation of migratory species. I doubt that there's any repercussions, if you like, from those treaties per se, but it would be a very bad look for Australia in the international arena, given that Australia already has the highest rate of mammalian extinctions of any continent on the Earth. And we're rapidly catching up, unfortunately, with an ever-increasing number of bird species that are becoming at greater risk of extinction. So if nothing else, it would be more a case of the federal government looking to avoid embarrassment in international arena and fora, because it's not something that any government wants to have a species go extinct on its watch. So that would be probably the greatest driver for government response or change, rather than a genuine commitment to protect the species. But that's just me being cynical, perhaps.
Yeah. All right. And we've got another question. Could they also be encouraged to breed in Victoria? Eric, you might be a good one at the question.
Okay, so the birds have evolved what we call a life history strategy that takes advantage of the environmental conditions. And the reason that they breed in Tasmania and disappear to the mainland is that the food availability for them that they need during the breeding season, which is high to feed themselves and their offspring, is here in Tasmania, and that's the blue gum. And we know that in years of poor blue gum flowering, there's lower breeding success if they're dependent on secondary species. So the reality is these birds have evolved a strategy of breeding in Tasmania and then going to the mainland to survive the winter months on the mainland and then return to Tasmania the following year is an evolutionary strategy that has evolved over millions of years to maximise the potential or the survival for the species. So changing them to breed on the mainland and either not migrate or come to Tasmania, you're playing God, and more often than not, any efforts like that generally don't work very well, if at all.
Okay, great, excellent. Well, I think we're coming very much close to time. So I think we might wrap up things here. I would like to thank everyone for such an engaging range of questions. It's been really good. And it's great to see such a great number of people coming along today. So as I said, we really rely on your help with this one. Sign the petition, email the Premier, the Resources Minister and the Environment Minister, and tell them why it's important that we offer adequate protection to the Swift Parrot. If you'd like to find out more, I've typed the website into the chat, and you can find it at the Tree Project's website. So that's www.thetreeprojects.com /Swift Parrot, one word. And here you can read about the report, you can download the report, and it has a link down the bottom to the petitions, and it also has the emails of Premier Gutwin and co. So yeah, thank you so much. We're really excited to have presented this to you. If anyone's interested, the Tasmanian Independent Science Council is hosting another webinar on Thursday at 6 p.m. So this webinar is a threatened species forum. So we'll be looking at a range of different species. I will be talking again about this report and the Swift Parrots, but we have some excellent speakers talking about the Tasmanian handfish and also the Tasmanian devil. We also have Professor Ben Richardson that will be talking about threatened species legislation, which will be a really interesting topic. So you can find more details about that if you head to Facebook and you look for the Tasmanian Independent Science Council, and also you can have a look by searching on Eventbrite as well too. So I'd just like to say again a massive thank you to everyone, and if you have any further questions you can contact me at thetreeprojects @gmail.com, and our contact details are on the Tree Project website too. So thank you very much, and a big thank you to our excellent co-hosts, Eric Vola, Dr. Eric Vola, and Tom Allen from the Wilderness Society. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jen. Well done. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.